Thanks, Meryl. If you're old enough and you hang around long enough and you spend enough of other people's money, you get to take credit for almost everything. So, significant parts of that introduction were true. Thanks, Meryl. It was a great invitation, and a surprising amount is going on here at Montclair State. I knew about some of it. We funded some of it, but getting a closer look at the Center for Cooperative Media and the New Jersey News Commons has been a great experience getting an update. I really think that this university is able to say that it's addressing the crisis in local accountability journalism in a modern way, in a networked, dynamic way, not trying to save journalism so much as to invent it, which is what really has to happen. And Montclair is an important part of our New Jersey projects, made possible by the Dodge Foundation and Jeff Jarvis sitting there looking at me, and of course their partners, and that would be us, Knight Foundation. We're here to talk about local news ecosystems, and there's a couple of different ways that ecosystems get defined. The first one is that it is a system of a community of organisms interacting with their environment. And the second common definition of an ecosystem is that it's a system of interconnected parts, as in a business. So those are two different things, really, I think. I mean, one is alive, organic, and ever evolving. And the other one is more static and maybe more predictable. It reminds me of the Knight brothers. The generosity of the brothers is what created Knight Foundation. The wealth they accumulated building what was at the time the nation's largest newspaper group made our endowment. I wasn't there, but it's a fair guess, given the times, that the brothers did not sit around and while away the hours talking about news ecosystems. But somehow, the way they ran the business reflects those two definitions of news ecosystems. Jack ran the editorial side of Knight newspapers. He thrived in the organic ecosystem of communities interacting with news. He insisted his editors be independent and that every newspaper reflect that community. Jim Knight called himself the nuts and bolts man, and he thrived in the ecosystem of moving parts that make up things like a business. He standardized the overall operations of the Knight papers, things like presses, trucks, anything with nuts and bolts, he loved. And those things were pretty much the same from one community to the next. So the lesson that I took from that is that business practices are important, but at the same time, every community is different. So I think that local news operations will do well in the 21st century if they can do four things: customize especially content, embrace technology, engage community, and standardize and professionalize their business practices. I once headlined these the 4 C's: content, connectivity, community, and cash. But then when Larry Kramer used all kinds of C's in his book, Seascape, I renamed them. In ecosystem terms, these are like fundamental elements, like air, light air, soil, and water, things that have to be there to inspire growth. Some of the news organizations here, the local ones in this room, exist because of how well they're doing in those fundamental categories. And that's the good news. You're here. The survival of local news startups is actually much higher than average startups or average nonprofit startups. Local news operators are tenacious as all get out. They just don't want to die. The bad news is that you have a long way to go. So I hope you take my sometimes pointed questions in that spirit to help us, as a way to help you get there, because I am a fan. So first, customized content. Communities are like microclimates. Not everything grows everywhere. I was in Amsterdam and I went through this whole rigmarole to bring back tulip bulbs. You got to get the ones with the permits. You got to go through special customs. So I come back with all these tulip bulbs, send them to my friends all over the country. And I'm happy to report now, 5 months later, there are tulips in the Northwest. There are tulips in Nebraska in the Midwest. There are tulips in New York. But there are no tulips in my garden in South Florida. And we tried. It turns out that tulip bulbs have to feel like they've had a winter in Amsterdam before they want to come up in April. And in my backyard, they're just not feeling it. So I think news is like that too. I think local news ecosystems are like that too. Tulips don't work everywhere, and neither does a lot of local news. People are the organisms that complicate the news ecosystems. We need to pay more attention to them. People search for our news, or they don't. They understand it, share it, use it, create their own, or they don't. And they shape and are shaped by their communities in ways that we don't really fully understand. In Florida, we're surrounded by water. I've got the ocean, the Gulf, the Everglades, the Bay. Living there, I developed what our Vice President for Journalism and Media Innovation, Michael Manus, calls topic love for water. So fishing apps, weather apps, boating, beaches, cooking seafood, the chemicals in my tap water, and all the strange exotic creatures in the Everglades. I can't get enough of any of that. Topic love. The community character drives more than just the content. Davis Wiki works in Davis, a standalone California community that loves to ride bikes, but good luck trying to transplant it somewhere else. In Columbia, Missouri, there's an assertive newspaper that has pushed local government to be open and have open data. So the Daily Tribune is able to scrape up all of that open data using an open source platform called OpenBlock and display it in a system called Neighborhoods. And it's a big success. But just try getting that same thing to happen in a community where they've privatized the City Hall data. On a larger scale, it's hard to imagine ProPublica having all of the great national news partnerships that it has if it were in, say, Austin, Texas, and not New York. And it's in Austin, Texas, it turns out that it's a great place to run a digital site that is devoted only to Texas politics. And you can have a success doing that. And this goes on. In Little Deerfield, New Hampshire, their website has lasted for years and years because they have great volunteers and a great library. Being in Boston helps the New England Center for Investigative Reporting survive at Boston University because high school students from all over the country want to spend time in Boston looking at colleges. So they run a summer boot camp for high school journalism students and make money that then they use for investigative journalism. In St. Louis, leading citizens contributed millions of dollars and helped make the merger between the St. Louis Beacon and the University of Missouri's St. Louis campus radio station possible. So for those who are here for the conference thinking about local journalism, ask yourselves, what do you really know about your community? Ask it this way. Do you know as much about your community as the commercial data miners or the political data miners know? We investigate the big data of other people, but we don't have enough big data of our own. We don't have amazing databases of our users. We don't know the topic love of all of our people. Now, with a grant from Knight Foundation, the Voice of San Diego and MinPost are rebuilding their customer and relationship management systems so they can have real-time customer data. Customer data is, in ecosystem terms, like our sunlight. We really have to have it. Next is embracing technology. Now, news organizations that many are at this conference are children of technology. But tech moves like lightning and strikes its own children. And Moore's law suggests that a digital lifetime is less than 2 years. So if you're 10 years old, you are in digital years 5 lifetimes old. If you haven't changed during that 10 years, you've missed serious games, social and mobile media, data journalism, and a lot of other things. If you don't change, you'll die. You're actually legacy media, 10-year-old legacy media. This week I asked the Investigative News Network if they knew the total web traffic of their 90 some odd members. They did. I'll give you those numbers in a minute, but the point I want to make at this part is that the social media footprint of the members, these nonprofit news organizations, many local, is just a fraction, a third of the web presence. And I wonder if that's an indicator of a problem. Are the local or the new news organizations keeping up? For many daily papers these days, mobile traffic makes up more than half of a newspaper's traffic. And I wonder if those of you who are here as people who run local news sites, is mobile traffic half of your traffic? Now, to embrace technology, you need to be a technologist or work with them. I don't think it's any coincidence that some of the more successful startups that we studied, we had a report on our website called Finding a Foothold, and analyzed the finances and the digital and technological work of a bunch of nonprofit news sites. The successful ones had greater technological expertise, either in-house or through others, than did the ones that were struggling. Now, I'm not saying everyone has to hire all their technologists. There are companies like the Alternative Press here and banking on the idea that they can be the back of the house operation for solo operators, solo journalism operators, and thriving under the Jarvis Link economy. They think they're better than Patch because their news providers are of the communities where they work, and they have a point. But even solo operators can use better tools. Things like Document Cloud, Overview. I just saw a new one, Quill, Timeline.js, Videolicious. Knight has endowed these digital tools with a training program that's done by the American Press Institute and Poynter Institute. These tools can save time. They can improve the quality of journalism. They can turn one journalist into many journalists. It's free training, and yet everyone doesn't do it. And I would be willing to bet that there's a significant percentage of the folks who are here for this conference who haven't even heard of News University, even though 280,000 people have. So if you try new products and spin-offs, the question is, are you doing it the digital way? We have a trustee, Joey Ito, who's from the Media Lab at MIT, and he observes that the digital age favors practice over theory, and that it's easier and cheaper to just build something than it is to debate and plan and scheme. And by that time, you spent more money than it would have cost you to just do it. Michael Manus thinks that what we lack today is transformational leadership. People who like to build things fast and cheap, and then test and rebuild them. And he says it takes an average of at least 4 iterations to get something good enough to work well. In the end, the technology is like the air in our ecosystems, and the danger is it getting stale. And so if you feel the air in your newsroom is getting stale, open the window. So next is engaging community. Anxiety does a lot of things to people. One of them is that it causes us to leap more often and forcefully to conclusions. There's still a lot of high anxiety floating around journalism. Every few minutes, someone announces a new answer, a new model, and some of us just leap to that conclusion. So I say, hold on. The very idea of a model, of a static model, feels to me like a 20th century idea. What if in the 21st century the model is that there really isn't a single model? Is there such a thing as a model ecosystem? Would we want that? Customization and continuous change, they aren't really models so much as they are principles. This is a pet peeve of mine, so I shall continue. The word model is often used in the same sentence with the word scale, as in, please consider a grant to my project because it is a model that will scale. The other day, I ran into a foundation executive who said, of the 5,000 ideas he heard last year, he thought 2 were scalable, really scalable. Well, that means 99.96% of them he didn't think would scale. But he thought they were perfectly good ideas for the communities where they were born and could work very well there. Let me put it in another way. I called Knight's Stanford fellow Alexa Schertzinger, and she offered up 2 different examples of local news operations she thought were interesting. One was called Berkeley Side, and the other one was the Independent Media Network. Berkeley Side is I don't know what you would call it, a passionately local website focusing on everything Berkeley. And the Independent Media Network in Connecticut is a kind of advertising and technological network, really, that helps news sites make money. I wouldn't say they're models so much as I would say they're experiments. They came out of certain places for certain reasons. Before we declare anything to be a model, I think it should be proven to be functioning. The prototype should work. So if they work, they're candidates. Of all the digital age disruptions, the change from a passive audience to an interactive community is the greatest. Anyone can participate in news, break it, cover it, quickly debunk it. The question is, do we invite them as journalists into our news processes? Because they're really no longer our processes. Does the community help figure out what it is we should cover, help us cover it, help us spread it, and do they act on it? Are we curating news, providing filters for people and not just shining lights? Do we ever share their topic love? At the University of Illinois, Knight Chair Brant Houston is doing a project from a Challenge Fund for Innovation in Journalism Education grant to mine Twitter locally and try to use it as a springboard for coverage that otherwise wouldn't be happening. That's kind of like what is happening on a national scale from an organization called Policymic. How many people have heard of Policymic? Okay. It's not most of you because it's millennial news for millennials by millennials. And it's serious news because they're not supposed to like that. And in just a few years, I lost track when they got to 10 million uniques. I mean, it might be 12 by now. From 0 to more than 10 million in just a couple of years. Now, I should disclose that Knight Foundation's an investor in it, but you don't have to be to know their secret. They have a behavior analytics expert, a scientist, who helps them figure out what conversations are happening in social media among millennials. And then, instead of only publishing news we hope will create a conversation, it's backwards. They look at what the conversation is, and they tell people what news they have around that topic love. And they drive traffic like crazy. So, when you're considering new news products, those of us from legacy media should ask ourselves a question of what do we think of user-centric design? And I think most journalists 5 years ago had never heard of human-centered design or user-centered design. In some ways, it's kind of the opposite of journalism. We journalists run around and get the news from people who have something to say about this or that. User-centric design figures out how to conjure people's unexpressed needs. Can you imagine a journalist being assigned to get out there and find out the unexpressed needs of this community? They wouldn't have the faintest idea of how to do that because once you ask people, it's not an unexpressed need anymore, is it? So it's more anthropological the way that these folks go about it. But it's a key to understanding the new audiences and to creating new products. Not enough journalism schools, not enough news companies have embraced it, and yet the companies that have are conjuring multi-billion-dollar brands. Since the digital age has turned journalism inside out, the question is, should we not, in how we deal with communities, turn those processes inside out? Communities are the very earth in which we plant stories, in which we're all rooted. So finally, we have standard and professional business practices. It was great to see Michelle McClellan's article at the USC Knight Center newsletter saying that the Baltimore Fishbowl has dramatically increased its revenue by hiring a salesperson. I smiled when I saw that. I grant you it's an old and these days somewhat controversial, the standard practice, but obviously it can still work. So do sponsorships, memberships, cooperative ownership, micropayments, subscriptions, knowledge products, event revenue, premium services, and about 20 other things. Different things, it turns out, in different communities. One indicator of the health of a local news organization is diversity in revenues and expenses. So you draw out two pie charts. If you've got 3-4 slices of the pie in revenue, good, healthy. 3 or 4 slices of the pie in expenses, healthy, because then you've got to have some technology expenses, you've got to have some business expenses. And that's another of the findings from that study I mentioned that we have on our website. If you have a pie chart that shows that you get all of your money from a foundation and you spend all of it on stories, that's your expense chart, and there are no slices, you'll be dead in 2 to 4 years. Foundations do not permanently fund stories. Foundations go through something called foundation funder fatigue. Staff changes, initiatives change, and you just can't count on them for that. It's not a good business model. So the road ahead is still long. If there were a traditional television program or newspaper that was just 10 years old, we would know exactly what its reach was. There are folks who've been around for 100 years counting the reach of newspapers, auditing the reach of newspapers. But local startups are different. Here are those figures from the Investigative News Network. Kevin Davis says, on average, his 90 members, web and mobile, have monthly uniques, final quarter of last year, averaging just over 9.5 million. And their Twitter reach was 1.6 million, and their Facebook reach was about 1.5 million. But that's not the whole story, because it's just the INN members, and many of them sell or share their content with others. So let's take a close-up at the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism, located again on a college campus. Its monthly website uniques averaged 15,000. But the circulation of the 83 newspapers that used its stories was more than 750,000. It stretched every metropolitan area of the state. The center stories appeared on Wisconsin Public Radio, 455,000 listeners. They appeared on Wisconsin Public Television, which has 1.3 million households each week. So what's their reach? What's the number? Remember, it's a standard business practice to know these things. And it's hard for us to explain. ProPublica created something called Pixel Ping, which is some simple code that tracks page views of its stories when other people pick them up under Creative Commons and use them. So ProPublica knows that it had 16 million page views on its website in 2013, and it had 7 million page views on other people's websites. Okay, that's a start. But how many of the local news organizations here use Pixel Ping? Even ProPublica doesn't know when it co-sponsors content with one of its major partners. Loses track of the reach of that content at that point. Thanks. Somebody noticed. Thank you. So news startups are winning Pulitzer Prizes. That was Jack Knight's domain. No problem there. But where's Jim Knight when you really need him? The digital Jim Knight. Where are our standard and professional business practices that allow us to function as local news proprietors? And wouldn't it be easier, wouldn't our lives be easier if we could actually explain how many people saw what we did? So this is kind of like, I guess you could call it, the business flows, the flows of cash is kind of like the water of the ecosystem, and we still have very fixed ideas of how that should work, and we're sort of more in a Hoover Dam mentality than a Niagara Falls mentality. being able to count only those people you've trapped as daily newspaper subscribers is Hoover Dam. Knowing how much water is going over the edge there is Niagara Falls. But I may sound critical of all this, but I actually think it's quite exciting. People talk about the Gutenberg moment, the digital, shift from the mass media age started by Gutenberg to today. And it is that kind of shift. It's an entirely new age of human communication. But it feels like we're starting to have an Aldous Manutius moment. So who is Aldous Manutius? Gutenberg started fooling around with movable metal type before Aldous was born. Gutenberg was in Germany, Aldous was in Italy. Gutenberg printed really big Bibles, and that told you, how to get to heaven. And then he printed these indulgences, which the church sold so you could definitely get into heaven. He also printed a few official documents. It was Aldous who came along decades later and thought, he thought this in Renaissance Italian, hey, books should be small. Books should be able to fit in your pocket. Everybody should be able to read books. I can print like the classics, like Aristotle and things like that in the books. Type doesn't have to be the same way it is. I can make type that slants over so we have italic type. Punctuation, shouldn't we make that the same for everybody? This was Aldous Manutius. And he was really having fun. And he was giving people access to knowledge that they simply would not have had. He didn't know it at the time, but it was his idea for books, the mobile version of books, that would carry the day. And those are the books we have now, even on our Kindle. Fits in your pocket. So here we are, and it's too soon to say which of today's contenders will be the Aldous Manutius of local news in the digital age. It's quite possible there's not going to be one Aldous Manutius, that there might be a network of them leading a renaissance in community news. Imagine how wonderful it would be if future historians look back and said, a few of those Aldous Manutius digital pioneers were here in this room tonight. Thank you.